All right, it's that time. So good afternoon. I am Almas Maskatwala, community leader and co-founder of Faiths and Cultures in Conversation series. And it is my absolute joy to welcome each one of you to the third session of the Faiths in Conversation series. First and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Ali Asghar Ali Bhai, Assistant Professor of Art History at UT Dallas, and Dr. Nils Romer, Dean of the Harry W. Bass Jr. School of the Arts, Humanities, and Technology, for hosting this series at UT Dallas. Your leadership is greatly appreciated. Thank you. So the Faiths in Conversation, if this is your first time, I just kind of wanted to walk through like a brief kind of overview. The Faiths in Conversations initiative began in 2012 with 3 faith leaders representing 3 Abrahamic traditions with the goal of engaging in dialogue across different religious centers, rotating between a synagogue, mosque, and church. This model was successfully led by Dr. Robert Hunt of SMU until 2018. In 2019, as the chair of the Interfaith Council of Thanksgiving Foundation, I was able to revive the series, expanding its scope to include both Eastern and Western traditions and cultures. The monthly sessions provided opportunities for people from various cultures, faiths, and traditions to learn about the religions of their neighbors. Scholars from across the United States, Canada, and India participated, offering academic perspectives on faiths rather than interpretations from practitioners. These sessions, held in person and via Zoom, explored themes like the role of intellect, faith and justice, environmental stewardship, and the relationship between faith and society. The essence of this series continues to highlight religion and culture as community affairs, not merely private practices. Religious communities and their cultural expressions exist in relation with the broader society to which they belong. The vision of this project is to educate objectively and inspire everyone to embrace the diversity in our communities with an attitude of pluralism and cosmopolitan ethics. Here, I would like to quote His Highness the Aga Khan, spiritual leader of the Ismaili Muslim community, whose words and work has inspired me to lead this series. He says, "A pluralist cosmopolitan society is a society which not only accepts difference, but actively seeks to understand it and to learn from it." In this perspective, diversity is not a burden to be endured, but an opportunity to be welcomed. A cosmopolitan society regards the distinctive threads of our particular identities as elements that bring beauty to the larger social fabric. A cosmopolitan ethic accepts our ultimate moral responsibility to the whole of humanity, rather than absolutizing a presumably exceptional part. End of quote. With this ethos of pluralism in mind, this year's Faiths and Cultures in Conversation series is themed around sacred places. We are thrilled to present our third session featuring Dr. Taurean J. Webb. Dr. Webb is a Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow in Comparative Race and Ethnicity Studies at DePaul University. His research and teaching focus on Black internationalism, Black-Palestinian transnationalism, Black religious history, international human rights, and the intersection of visual arts and religious metaphors in contemporary social movements. His published work has appeared in the Journal for Palestine Studies, Journal of Middle Eastern Politics and Policy, Jadalia, Contending Modernities, and Black Perspectives, the award-winning blog of the African American Intellectual History Society. Dr. Webb was recently named an Arts Fellow at Princeton University's Crossroads Project, Black Religious Histories, Communities, and Cultures, where he's working on his first documentary film, a project centered on Black, Palestinian, and Lebanese visual artists. I can't wait to see this documentary. Today, Dr. Webb is going to be presenting on A Plain and Sacred Vision on art making, love songs, and building community in times of war. After his presentation, Dr. Webb will be joined by Dr. Ali Bhai and Dr. Nagvi for a discussion of the key points of the presentation, which will be followed by audience question answer segment, which will be facilitated by Dr. Ali Bhai and Dr. Nagvi. Please use the chat feature to submit questions and comments, and our moderators will facilitate the discussion accordingly. And finally, I'm also excited to inform everyone that our next session is scheduled for October 28th at 1:30 p.m. with Dr. Netta Bodner, an art historian from Israel whose research focuses on medieval art and architecture. She will present on hydraulic architecture in medieval Jewish traditions. And that's why the time is going to be 1:30 p.m. We're trying to accommodate her time zone. And with that, I want to invite Dr. Webb to lead the way for an insightful presentation. Thank you. Dr. Webb, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Almas. Am I heard okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I am so honored to be here. So many thanks to the Faith and Cultures and Conversation team for inviting me and for making this happen. I'm just going to adjust my screen briefly over this way. Okay. I recognize this space, right? This space that we are in together, that we're invited into, right? The space that I was invited into to be a collaborative one, right? As I understand it, both academic and scholarly, right? A conversation among colleagues and peers and students, and perhaps also institutional, right? Wrestling with all sorts of questions about how to function efficiently and collegially in a moment when trust in institutions is breaking down everywhere. And also community-based, right? Where we're all just trying to figure out how to just be, right? Be with each other. So academic, institutional, and community-based. Because of the unique kinds of challenges embedded within the very nature of these collaborative spaces, I approach such spaces a bit differently. I try to hold these spaces differently than I would in a more kind of traditional academic presentation or in a more traditional kind of community-based facilitation. What I will try to do today is speak to a range of issues in such a way that the different constituencies represented will be able to kind of find themselves, right? Perhaps see themselves, or at least find something that resonates with us. I do think that so much of this kind of work, this kind of work that I imagine that this conversation series is doing, as well as the kind of work that I do as a researcher, as a writer, as a thinker, has very much to do with recognizing how and where we enter, okay? I'm entering this space as an artist, as a thinker, as a writer, and following in the tradition as I am as a student of the ethnic studies, right? A thinker that is deeply committed to lived experience, on the ground realities, and social movement. Okay? A plain and sacred vision on art making, love songs, and building community in times of war. I'll enter here, and we can think about this as a kind of epigraph of sorts, so, an offering, right? Of how I enter these kinds of dialogues and these kinds of moments. This is a passage that happens to be the standalone favorite passage, my standalone favorite passage in all of literature, from my favorite book in all of literature. And it says this: every generation confronts the task of choosing its own past. Inheritances are chosen as much as they are passed on. The past depends less on what happened then than on the desires and discontents of the present. The strivings and failures shape the stories we tell. What we recall has as much to do with the terrible thing we hope to avoid as it does with the life for which we yearn. But when, friends, does one decide to stop looking to the past and conceive of a new order? When is it time to dream of another country, or embrace others as other strangers as allies, or to make an opening, an overture where there is none? When is it clear that the old life is over and a new one has begun, and there's no looking back? From the holding cell, she said, was it possible to see beyond the end of the world and imagine a living and breathing again? The rebels, the come, go back child, and I are all returnees. We're all returnees, circling back to times past, revisiting routes that might have led to alternative presents, salvaging dreams unrealized and defeated, crossing over to parallel lives, right? The hope is that return could resolve some of the old dilemmas, make a victory out of defeat, and engender a new order. And the disappointment, of course, is that there is no going back to a former condition. Loss fundamentally remakes us. Return is as much about the world to which we no longer belong as it is about the one in which we have yet to make home. End quote. This is Saidiya Hartman, a passage from her iconic text, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. Hartman here is wrestling with what it means to be a woman of African descent in the US with Ghanaian roots, okay? With Ghanaian roots, traveling back to her ancestral homeland in search of something, but not ever quite finding it. It's a familiar story of a people in exile, right? People in diaspora. This is a moment of rupture, okay? It's a moment of rupture that, in my opinion, touches on all of Black life in diaspora. What does it mean to be bounded within a space that shows no signs of respecting you or the kinds of knowledges that you produce? But what grips me here, right, is the constructive possibility of reimagining what home space can be, even if what it must be, is something always in movement, right? Always in transition, right? The oceanic, some scholars call it, in the hull of the slave ship, right? What we have is each other. What we have is each other. That is a sensibility. Perhaps the sensibility that anchors my approach to and my reading of the histories of transnational movement building. African historian John Henrik Clarke famously said, I quote, "In the end, none of us have any place to go except toward each other." End quote. What does it mean, then, to think about this in the context of liberation struggle? Revolutionary liberationist struggle. One of my great preoccupations as a scholar and a researcher and a teacher is transnational social movement, right? Particularly thinking about how race and religion are inflected within them. And what creative cultural expression, culture, right? Creative culture, particularly the visual arts. That's kind of my lane. What this means within these social movements that are every day bidding against regimes of power that are oftentimes profoundly visual. Systems that make spectacles out of violence, right? Violence against bodies, violence against cultures, violence against bodies that are differently abled, right? Turning them into theaters of absurdity, right? Spectacles of violence that lay claim to, that are the home of the theater of the absurd, right? This is one of the harsh realities that brought a lot of folks in the 20th century back into remembrances of Black-Palestinian third worldist solidarity in the 20th century. It wasn't quite a Black-Palestinian transnationalism that we think of today, but it was a, in my reading, and certainly in my reading of the Black thought tradition, this is a Black internationalist third worldism. Okay, it's a third worldism that understood historic Palestine as a sister site, as a site, one site on the continuum, with a number of other sites, right, of liberationist struggle. Curry Smith Peterson, one of the co-authors of the historic 2015 Black Solidarity Statement with Palestine, when I interviewed him for my current book project, he said this. And to be clear, I interviewed Curry prior to October 7th of last year, right? And in a significant and very significant way. The world that I've said this to my children, youngsters, like the world that you all woke up into on October 8th is a different world. It's a different world now, right? So I interviewed Curry prior to this moment. He said this, quote, I think about the 2008-2009 attack on Gaza, both then and the 2014 attack. It was this kind of spectacular violence. Israeli military really made a spectacle of the bombing. And one of the ways that it was literally a spectacle was when we saw footage in 2018 of Israeli settlers near Gaza sitting and watching the bombing and applauding when they would see one explode. It called to mind images of lynched Black bodies as this very public spectacle. Then 2014 Ferguson happened. It was a sort of coincidence of spectacular Israeli violence and Black resistance. And it mattered to us, end quote. And the 2014 Ferguson moment, the Courier is talking about here, for folks who might not be as familiar, he's talking about the 2014 police killing of Mike Brown Jr. In Ferguson, St. Louis County, Missouri, and the civil resistance that arose in its wake. That's the moment that he's talking about. But this moment was also bounded within a moment where a reimagining of Black politics was already afoot. It was already happening, right? So when these two realities coincide, when they clashed together coterminously, right? One of these hyper-visual spectacles of violence, right, alongside this deep questioning of what is Black politics to begin with, right? When these two moments combined, it reopened a kind of portal of sorts, right? In an interesting sort of way. It reopened spaces for dialogue about what it means to inhabit, for what it means for different communities who are perpetually under the heavy hand of systemic violence to inhabit spaces of violence together. Okay? But there's always, to me, been something interesting about gazing only at spectacles of violence, right? Something, I always feel like we seem to miss something. And to me, perhaps following Hartman here to get closer to that thing that I feel like we miss, I think in language of the excess, something is spilling over, right? Something is bleeding out of, something is unable to be captured, not capturable quite. Something missing. And we need to turn into the sensorium in a different kind of way, right? Lean into the human sensory experience in a different kind of way in order to access something constructive in a way that the civic and political perhaps can't quite help us access, I think. Different kinds of human senses. And creatives, Black creatives have been saying this for decades. Like I'm not, this is not original. Black musicians and writers for decades have been making this point. James Baldwin made the point. Toni Morrison made the same point. There is a place that literature can take us that popular parlance and conversation can never help us go. There is a place that music can take us, Baldwin said. A particular kind of place that the written word, the spoken word, can never quite help us get to, right? So I'm understanding this argument that I'm offering, kind of in that kind of tradition. These things that register with us on different affective levels. In part, for me, my turn into this excess has been fundamentally constituted by leaning into the artistic, right? One of the essays that I assign the graduate students here to read is Nora Ericot's Geographies of Intimacy. And I love this language of the intimate, right? The proximate. What does it mean to be with each other, right? And how ought we understand things like storytelling, that happens when we are with each other as a kind of sacred craft, allowing us to engage in community building as resistance in a different way. Ericott says, quote, any possibility, any possible sharedness, any possible sharedness is fundamentally shaped by a structure of intimacy, buried within the overshadowed, sometimes unspoken stories. A realm of feelings, she says, cultivated by and nurtured within social kinship. Right? This kind of social kinship that's always in motion, right? Kind of gesturing back to Hartman, always in motion. Many of these ideas didn't quite crystallize for me until I was on fellowship at Harvard from 2020 to 2022, and from that space, I executive produced a traveling visual arts exhibit, and I'm currently producing, as you all heard in the bio, currently producing a short film based on that exhibit. The exhibit and therefore the film brings together roughly 20 artists, visual artists. About half of them are from the Palestinian diaspora and exilic migration. My artists are Palestinian, Palestinian American, and Palestinian Australian. The other half are roughly the other half, and I've one Lebanese American artist. The other half are roughly from the African diaspora. I have African American artists, I have Ghanaian artists, I have a brilliant Afro-Hawaiian photographer, photojournalist, as she self-identifies. And these artists represent about 9 different artistic mediums. Okay? Digital collage, photography, painting, sketch, sculpture, a few others. But all kind of organized around a central question, right? That question is this: in whatever way is most meaningful to you, use portraiture as form, I invited them, as a way to reflect on something about the nature of the relationship between humanity and the sacred. And for me, what was most interesting was not just the window that gave me access into different kinds of stories, right? But that in listening to enough of these stories, seemingly disparate and unrelated, from a posture of curiosity, right? From a posture of curiosity, I heard a range of ways that these stories were speaking back to each other, right? Speaking back to each other. So I brought with me an excerpt from the film for you all to hopefully hear some of that. But before I get into that, I wanted to situate you within some of the works first. So I'm getting ready to share share my screen and just kind of talk through a couple things. And you'll see the clip at the end of that. But pay attention to whatever you like, whatever kind of strikes you as most interesting, or not. But I'm inviting you to listen for if there are any moments where you hear stories kind of speaking back to each other. But I'll first kind of situate you in the works first. So I'm going to move to share my screen. One moment. Okay. Can somebody maybe just unmute and just kind of shout and let me know if you can see this okay and still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So rather quickly, I won't spend a whole lot of um time here, but this is so you shall inherit the earth. This is the title of the first iteration of the exhibit. This is the logo of the project. These are two variations of the logo. On the left here, you will see. So this is an olive tree. It's a representation of an olive tree and an indigenous tree to the region, to historic Palestine. And also you'll see here on the left a stylized logo of the West African Sankofa bird, right? A bird kind of facing one direction and looking back towards its back. You'll sometimes see a little egg on the back of the bird, and the idea here is to represent kind of moving forward, but always kind of looking back to where one has from where one has come. So bird on the left, the bird on the right. This is a stylized. It's actually a stylized version of the logo, the Institute for Palestine Studies logo. With permission, they allowed me to use this logo and my logo. And this is a stylized depiction of a bird motif that was found on ancient Philistine era pottery. And it's always been interesting to me the way even the birds in the logo kind of speak back to each other, right? So these are just a couple images. So Steve Wanos, the Lebanese American artist in the show, he created a sculpture installation, and he's based in DC, and he built it in his studio in DC, created it up, and drove it from DC to our inventory site in Chicago. And it's an installation piece that also has a sound composition as a part of it, where he fused African indigenous musical traditions with Lebanese musical traditions. A brilliant piece. So that's our three-dimensional installation box. It's crated up. One of the most one of my favorite and one of the most impactful works in the show for me is this top portrait on the right. So the only artist in the show that has that has since passed away a couple years ago. Charles Haddad was a Palestinian American artist. He's gifted a camera as a young boy on the eve of the 1948 expulsion from his homeland, and he took photos of family and friends in refugee camps throughout Aleppo, in particular in the 50s and 60s. And as a man in his 80s, had shoeboxes full of black and white 4x6 stills. And we blew up three of them for the show into larger dimensions. These are two of them, two of the three in the show, and this top image is of his grandmother. It's always been one of my favorite in the production. These are two of the larger works in the show. These are collaborative works by Shawnee Crow. She is a Chicago-based African-American Chicago-based mixed media artist. She is the braid artist here. So she is a photographer and braid artist. She braids hair in very intricate designs that harken back to, in her estimation, African royalty. Max Sansing is the painter here. As a quick fun fact for anyone who might be interested, if you watch SNL, several years ago, you might have seen Solange's performance on SNL with her hair braided in a really intricate pattern. Shawnee, the braid artist and the photographer from these two works, braided her hair. The story goes, her works were on display at the Brooklyn Museum. Beyonce and Jay-Z walked past it while the display was up, fell in love with it, contacted the artist, They connected with Solange, and Shawnee tells of how she flew to the SNL site and spent a painstaking amount of hours braiding Solange's hair for the show. So that's just a fun fact that I always like to note. Shireen, and forgive the speed with which we're running through this. Shireen Damra this is a Palestinian American artist, right? Some of you might have seen these images, two images in the show. You might have seen this Breonna Taylor image. You really might have seen either of these two images that she did to commemorate the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. She does these frontal busts of victims of anti-Black police violence and vigilante violence, and her work really took great traction, gained great traction in the movement for Black lives. A lot of people don't know this is a Palestinian artist. Nikki Kwame Nwowu is a brilliant, brilliant Afro-Hawaiian photographer, photojournalist. This is two of the three pieces that we have of hers in the show. The image on the left is of a mosque, a woman in a mosque in Somalia, I believe. And the image on the right is Ethiopian Christians in prayer. Lux Eterna is a Palestinian Australian artist. I won't say a lot about this piece because in the video clip that I'll show you all, Lux will lend her own voice to it. Andrea Coleman is a African-American Chicago-based digital collage artist. She takes old family photos that she articulates herself as being kind of called into. She blows them up to ginormous. She digitally augments them and blows them up to enormous scale, printed scale. Two of her works in the show, and this is also when we were getting ready for the install. Here as well. Layla is a Palestinian American artist, a brilliant, brilliant young artist. You might have seen any one of these three images in a graphic novel that she was commissioned to illustrate. The originals are with us and traveling in the show. Another image of Layla's that is in the show. So that was a quick run through. So here we're approaching just a brief excerpt from the film, and this is where I'd invite you to listen, listen for the resonances, and I hope you enjoy it.
I also like to work with time in such a way that, I think about before time.
Really quickly, is the audio okay there still?
It was hazy in the beginning, but now, when she started to talk, we could hear.
Okay.
Beyond time, like what does that look like? What does it look like for this work to exist in the now? But also, what if somebody was to find this work, 50 years from now, 2,000 years from now? What would it say about us? What story would it tell? What insight would it give? So I think inadvertently works are always chronicles and markers of time. But I also think it's interesting to, think about time when making the work. Like, what's the future of this work and what's the past? What's the resonant history of this? How did it come to be? What's its context as well?
One thing that we often hear said about artistic production, creative cultural production, is that these mediums oftentimes invite communities into imagining different sorts of possibilities, right? Invites communities into imagining different sorts of futures, right? It might not have been imaginable otherwise necessarily. Can you speak a little bit about the role of imagination in your work and more specifically, what sorts of imagination you hope your work to spark?
Yeah, I think imagination is a huge part of my work and a big thing that I think about. Just in terms of what I've been talking about around sort of like mainstreamed, even though within Palestinian, discourses like the Palestinian discourse is always sort of like running counter to the wider mainstream. But within that, like, I think that one of the things that's important to me is our ability as Palestinians to expand our allow ourselves to expand our imagination around who we are. I think that there's sometimes I've noticed within Palestinian communities, almost like this, this need to establish authenticity because we are without a state and because we are producing our national imaginary without a state. There is this intense need to present ourselves as authentic in order to validate ourselves and our existence to the world. And in some ways that can lead to a flattening of our culture, an erasure of difference.
Given that the portrait that I've showcased features the entire body as opposed to a typical portrait, which is just the bust, probably connects to my focus on embodiment and how the body is a part of the landscape and vice versa. I think it's really important not to sever, that body-mind connection, that body-mind land. There's a psyche in the land that is us as well. You actually asked me that question about, the portrait being this house of the spirit almost, this sacred text of the spirit. And I'd never thought about it that way until, our discussions.
To me, they're very almost sculptural, like photographs, like people have a presence, like they take up space, and it's not just their physical being, though clearly you can see sort of his fascination with the shadows and the dark and the light and the shape of them. But their being also has, like, you can see their personhood in a way, which is really kind of fascinating, and so I think, they were real people, and that's what he was trying to capture, whether he could describe that to you or not, and the other thing they capture, I think, very well is that between you get the sense that there's someone else in the room, and so it's not just the reality of them and sort of the space they're taking up, but it's whatever exists between them and the person who's taking the photograph.
And I've had a lot of people end up in front of my photos and not know why they were there. It's something about the photo I don't understand. And I think it's the space in between is the mysticism that allows like this whole process of emotions and trauma to be there, to sit there, and you wouldn't experience them. So there's room for that. And I think that's why I really love how my photos give room to all of those emotions. And it's 2D. It's not necessarily, so it gives it a three-dimensionality to it. So they have layers, flat layers, but the fact and the experience and the narratives behind it, the people behind it, the things that hold within the eyes behind it, like, something's there more than just the image.
The work that I make in traveling, in going to places that are people who've also been colonized, and seeing how they've figured out ways to continue living, really, right? To find joy, to exist in their spaces. I hope that people of color here can sort of look at it and sort of recognize that there are billions of us. It's not just us, that we're not just this isolated community alone.
And that there are possibilities for thriving.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's the survival, and it's also the possibilities for thriving that are kind of opened up when we imagine a different type of human community.
Absolutely.
Right? Imagine ourselves as part of a different type, a more vast human community. So thank you. Thank you for that. Hey. So one moment. This out of here. So as a scholar of religion, I'm always fascinated with how communities give voice to questions of ultimate concern, right? Things of or relating to hope, possibility, utopia, time, futurity, the relationship between the world as it is versus the world as it should be. I'm less interested in religion as such, right? Vis-a-vis the formal structures of governance and sociality that we tend to understand as organized religion, right? I'm not completely uninterested in this. I should articulate one thing about the film I should articulate before we get too far from it. Those excerpts, that part of the film that you all saw, this was all filmed prior to October 7th of last year, okay? One thing I should articulate about the artists represented in my creative work is that there's a range of racial religious diversity. We have Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims represented, African American Christians, Black Muslims, Black agnostics. We have an African indigenous spirituality practitioner, right? So I'm not uninterested in these broad religious categories and how folks can find space for themselves and for others in those categories of different. But my focus is less on those categories and more on what I in some of my work call the theological grammars that transcend and subvert them, right? Here's the theoretical grounding for this. Racial capitalism's repertoire of inordinate violence, right, is anchored in oppositional hierarchies, right? Always. A foundational hierarchy and one that has bedrocked how persons come to understand the very idea of production, of capital, property, of humanity, is the opposition between the profane and the sacred. Right, profane and the sacred. Here I follow J. Cameron Carter's articulation of Black sacrality, of the sacred, and how he uses it to both track us into as well as engage the larger problem of political theology, as he calls it. Modernity's idea of world, of a world, and how the rational man figures inside of it only comes into existence as a logical, as a coherent, as a cohesive, self-contained thought structure. It's very Western, right? To think outside of such a structure, following Carter as he follows Fred Moten's work, if you're interested in the citations, is to, quote, improv the very idea of a world in the first place by evacuating and abandoning any commitment to thinking in opposites, right? Thinking oppositionally is part of the challenge, part of the problem. In other words, thinking appositionally instead of thinking oppositionally, it centers something different. It centers the work that happens in the in-between, right? In between these opposite, what's happening in between these oppositional poles, right? The excess that we mentioned earlier that bleeds out, the movement that by very definition violates oppositional terms of order. It is this very idea of movement, passage, tuning my ear once again to Hartman, the persistent animation, Carter says, that makes endurance through capitalism possible. This is the excess that escapes capture and offends the very logics that the modern world seeks to maintain. Leaning into this excess, Fred Moten says it like this. It depends on a powerful faith in resurrection, ghosts, in spirits and specters. It's a faith in the possibility of something mystical. some mystical force rising from the abyss that blocks out any notion of modernity's continuity, end quote. This is what one might call the sacred, right? The unmitigated excess, and it antagonizes the problem of political theology. Again, following Carter, I understand political theology not as an invocation of like these two things, these two self-contained tracks. Like there is the theological and there is the political, and sometimes they antagonize, sometimes they bleed into each other. So that's not what I mean when I use political theology. Political theology is instead that philosophical and even metaphysical claim to the rightness, the correctness, the purity, the would-be gravity of the state, okay? The nation state in particular, as the telos of society, as the horizon of order, as that which secures and securitizes the world, right? That which secures and securitizes life itself. It is this presumption of the authoritativeness of and the givenness of the state as telos, kind of calling into itself social order. And it is that calling that seeks to eviscerate, but can never quite capture that low ground sacred. Because the excess is always just, they come out. They bleed out. And how do we know they bleed out? They come out in Jenny Haddad talking about her father's work, using the language, it's like there's someone else in the room, right? Or there's something more than just the image, or there's something existing between the object, right? The person taking the photograph and the photographed person. There's some movement in between there, right? A kind of visitation. The spectral, right? The excess comes out, and Andrea Coleman's talk about these flat layers of the visual becoming active in a tactile way, right? Literally pulling the viewer into the work's orbit like the sun does her planets, right? Quote, "I've had a lot of people end up in front of my photos and not know why they were there," she says. In talking about the Afrofuturist project, Ytasha Womack says that the time travel, immortality, reincarnation, parallel universe, these things, they create wormholes that transcend the limitations of history, while at the same time restoring power to both the narrator, right, the storyteller, and the hearers. Right? This is the power of creative expression within transnational social movement. And it allows us to both listen to story and re-story in a different way. I've gone on longer than I wanted to, but I'll end here. What does this mean for the present moment? I'm particularly holding dear the ways that this past spring, especially for those of us located, not exclusively, but particularly for those of us located within educational institutions, how this past spring has reminded us of just how fragile we all are, right? Fragile. People are fragile, right? Resistant and resilient, and at the same time, fragile, right? Running short on time and complicated. One of my students, I taught a course on art and activism in the 21st century during this past spring term. And one of my students said to me, at my institution, that there was a student-run encampment. One of my students said to me, quote, "Being part of our encampment was the first time I was ever food secure, end quote. These unarticulable, ungrammaticized pulses that disrupt the terms of order, they implicate how bodies show up in space, right? And the things that are troubled, epistemological, by those bodies showing up in space. This is why the emergence of encampments on college and university campuses all around the world, campuses that in an important way are the very nuclei of nation state thought projects, have been so profoundly disrupted in their university operations and in their respectability claims. Because the ungrammaticized, the excess that always disrupts terms of order en route to building a new kind of world. It's for this reason that historian Russell Rickford notes, I witnessed a safe, dynamic, radically inclusive space, an expression of what civil rights workers sometimes called the beloved community, a society that enshrines the practice of fellowship and agape love amidst the institution's ongoing efforts to criminalize with those that the Western world deems as disposable. On college campuses all over the world, one thing that we have seen is not just protest. It's not just dissent. It's those things, but it's not just those things. It is the building of what are these encampments, right? It's the building of a temporary counter institution, you all. The encampment as a makeshift university that is at once a library and a co-op and a mosque and a synagogue. And as my student mentioned, sometimes also safety from living a life in perpetual food insecurity. These are the best kinds of love songs that could ever be written. As John Henrik Clarke once said, again, it's a calling us into each other. As Hartman signaled, it's a building of new kinds of kinship webs amidst the very worst moments of crisis, where the possible, impossible without creative imagination, and a willingness to suspend judgment that could lead us into something quite beautiful and lovely. Should we be able to pause long enough to be curious and to listen? Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. That was a really engaging and wonderful talk. I appreciate you sharing with us so much of your work. Your work raises so many intriguing questions, and I have so many of them, and I'm saddened that I won't be able to ask all of them. But so I'm going to try to pick the ones that perhaps will have the widest appeal and most interest. And so the first thing that I really would love to hear you sort of speak to is you spoke very eloquently about the role of visual representation and the way in which that builds connectivity between people when they share these experiences, and the experiences of Black Americans with the experience of Palestinians. But I was also curious about the way in which those visuals, how those also work in tandem with, say, the way that they're shared spaces within communities within the United States, where people are interacting and talking. And would you be able to talk about the interplay between both the visual and then the power of the visual, but also the power of these shared spaces of outreach and community and connectivity there as well, and how they reinforce each other?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and I'm so that we could try to get the widest amount of conversation points on the table. I'll try to keep my responses as concise as possible. One thing that I'm really interested in thinking about is it means something in particular, and thinking about this relationship between the visual and bodies in space together, right? One thing that's always important to me is thinking about what it means for persons bounded within institutions, institutions that have historically not been built to accommodate their knowledges, to nevertheless see themselves in those institutions, right? There's a particular work happening, right? When, for instance, we installed the show in one iteration on a campus in Chicago. I had a student curator installing it after hours. She was installing one of Nikki Wu's works. I didn't show it here, but there's a woman in a field in Tanzania standing against a building, presumably her home. My student curator installed it after hours. A custodial worker walked up to her and said, let out this deep sigh and said, "This is my home, right? Tanzania," and walked away. It means something to see oneself in authentic and perhaps empowered ways, and one's experience and one's voice in ways and institutions that typically demand nothing from us but our labor, right? So for me, thinking about not just the visual, but any mediums of the creative, accompanying bodies as bodies occupy spaces, as bodies reside in spaces, whether that's religious institutions, college, university campuses, college, university formal spaces, as well as these more insurgent spaces on college and university campuses. There's something that can potentially, I think, bring folks in ways that, especially on the kinds of issues that I spend a good amount of time dealing with, working through, have the potential to bring folks in ways that direct conversations about things like anti-Black police and vigilante violence, or like direct conversation about a military occupation that shows no sign of slowing. Cannot do it, right? So if part of the work is bringing into kind of calling folks in a different kind of way, in a way that can be antagonistic, can be symbiotic and antagonistic without being violent, right? I think that's the calling in that we ought to strive for.
Thank you. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, this emphasis on storytelling was something that I think is a very powerful part of what you were speaking of. And it immediately made me think of the ways in which there's this diverse set of storytellers that are currently, working in these spaces of resistance. And I was hoping, would you be willing to share a little bit about how you see the interaction and the ways in which these different types of storytellers, whether they be, reporters or, TikTokers or visual artists or musicians, right? Like, how do these different mediums of storytelling sort of work together, or in some cases maybe work in very different ways to share these stories?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. One of the great, she would Charlene would never love me saying this, so don't tell her. But one of the great geniuses and giants that we have among us is a brilliant thinker and activist named Charlene Carruthers. We might have heard of her work, BYP 100. She's been very active in the movement for Black lives. I invited Charlene. She's a dear sister of mine. I invited Charlene to a Black Studies scholar, great Black Studies scholar. I invited her to come and sit with both my Black Freedom Movements class that I taught in before last spring, and my art and activism class that I taught in the spring term. And one thing that she said that always stuck with me, was she said, in moments of crisis where, I'm paraphrasing, in moments of crisis where everybody's searching for answers, and no one really has quite satisfying ones, folks look to the creatives, right, to help us explain and mediate these spaces, partially because it's not just a kind of first person account that's like talking at, but it's an invitation into a kind of accompaniment, right? It's my language, kind of accompaniment that I think creatives are uniquely positioned to walk with and facilitate, and not just, you know, the visual workers, you know, the writer. You know, some journalists understand themselves in this way. I think when we start thinking about you know, this may or may not have been part of your question. When we start thinking about things like news outlets, like reporters, and the way that we typically understand them, you know, that gets interesting, you know, and a bit questionable. But in my greatest hopes and aspirations, the utility of calling together a kind of symbiotic space. And again, in my estimation, a number of encampments that, as we've seen them operative this past spring, have been intentional about this. Can't speak to all of them, but knowing the commitment, they've been intentional about this. You build in systems, and folks have built in, and students have built in systems of care and accountability, right? That can accommodate when the system isn't functioning in the way quite that the system should be functioning. And it can hold things like, well, what happens when we're trying to take seriously this craft of storytelling, but for whatever range of reasons, we're in a moment of storytelling, and folks are not holding those stories as hearers in the ways that that are holding those stories as sacred, right? And conflict happens in the space, right? There's utility for that, but the space has to accommodate it intentionally. And I think being critical about engineering these collaborative spaces can accommodate that.
And I'm just gonna jump in and ask the question from a student.
Yep.
They were particularly struck by Leila Abdulrazak's work, and the image of the man smoking the cigarette, who they recognized as Ghassan Kanafani.
Yes.
And the student was remembering their quote, that it's not enough to hate and believe in the past to make a revolution. Hatred and belief in the past are sufficient prods for the rebellion phase. We must love and be future-oriented if we wish to carry out the revolution. So the student is asking, how can we foster community love in the face of repression and oppression when people naturally respond to these protests? And I'm going to compound that with another question of another student of these protests or activism becoming an alternate institution when they are responded with anger, hate, violence, and it's just another spectacle of violence again, as you mentioned earlier. How does that then foster community? How does it work? How is the power not ephemeral, but how do we kind of make it last? Right.
These are great and very palpable questions. So I'm pulling here, you know, back. I'm leaning in my own kind of embodiment as a person of African descent, but I'm feeling the weight of these questions. This question in particular, in my body memory, right? This is a very real and just a critical question, and a question that's touching on a number of issues that we and the campuses around the world have not yet resolved. I mean, we're still in it. We're still in this, right? So I wanna table that, and there are some of us. I like to think of myself kind of in this light, not believing that any institution will ultimately get us free, right? But at the same time, believing that it is possible to build and imagine a world in which institutions do and can do a little bit less harm, right? And that happens when communities of effect within and without those institutions hold institutions accountable to the things that they claim to believe, right? I believe in this work, and I recognize, you know, that doesn't have to be everybody's jam, but for me, I anchor this. I set my anchor down somewhere. This is one of those places. More directly to this question, part of what, at least I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer, but part of what I'm thinking about is there are communities and scholars, folks, talk about this. So on one level, we need to think really critically about what exactly it is that we mean by violence, right? Right? We tend to use a lot of language, all the buzzwords, right? Race, gender, sexuality, equality, and on and on. Violence is one of them, right? We use it presuming to know the meaning of it, presuming to know what we mean, and presuming what we mean is the same thing that other folks mean. That's not the case, right? One is being clear about what we mean and how we can think about different kinds of ways that communities are disproportionately affected by violence: physical, cultural, psychosocial, spiritual, and on and on. But I think another critical thing is to think about the ways that there are examples of how communities are thinking about things like care and policing in ways that do not depend on the realities of a militarized state, right? One thing that this real crazy to me is, and I'll when we are simultaneously expecting students in particular, other folk, but students in particular, to do the work of an institution building. Universities don't work unless students have a particular kind of social buy-in to them. When we continue to expect students to write the papers, do the finals, show up to class, pay the tuition, and on and on and on, and in response, meet them with hyper-militarized police violence, that's a symptom of an increasingly corporatized higher education model that is an appendage of the nation state, okay? It's an appendage of the state. And one thing we ought to be thinking seriously about, and by we here, I mean, all the constituency groups within higher education, all of them, from the bottom to the top, thinking about, well, what are the ways that communities have found success in managing things like conflict, managing things like dissent, managing things like internal antagonism in ways that do not require things like militarized force, right? Because communities have been thinking about this. I mean, this is one of the through lines of current conversations, for instance, of things like prison abolition, right, and police defunding. These are languages that sometimes scare us, but part of what folks are trying to get at there is not this idea that things like violence is just going to rule the day. Like, no, it's a deeper investigation into the conditions that give rise to such violence in the first place and how to meet those differently. When my student is telling me that the first time she's felt food secure has been in the encampment at our institution this past spring, she's commenting there about a deeper problem, a deeper problem that's real and real deep, and that we have to be able to hold in our frame the different kinds of experiences and the different kinds of violences, and the ones in which we ourselves are implicated in relation to the people in our spaces, and work from that point.
And I want to go back to your logo, and I'm in a class full of visual artists, and also PhDs in visual and performing arts that are not only practicing, but also looking at ways, and something that we worked on in this class was reimagining, along with reparations, along with restitutions. We talked a lot about different ways that artists and activist artists have dealt with this. But then reimagining, again, if it's ephemeral, how and if it's also in contact with the institutions that render it legitimacy, but also take away that legitimacy at the same time. In your vision, how do artists sort of work within this paradigm that seems so ephemeral itself that it's out of their control. Is it more reimagining something new? Because I'm going back to the logo of the birds looking back and looking forward. How does one balance that?
I want to apologize in advance because this is, I think, going to be a very unsatisfactory answer, and as much as I'm enjoying our time together, I do have to run to another event. But my response, how do they manage it? Very carefully. No, but in all seriousness, you know, I think part of this has to do with, so when we think about the different registers on which the artistic kind of operates, I think one thing that we have to get real about is recognizing that just as diverse as the arts is and can be, so are people in community with a range of different learning styles, a range of different affective resonances. So to think about the different kinds of the production that we build and offer as you know, no less real than any other, right? I think is an important starting point. Is an important starting point. That's what comes to me. That's what comes to me at the moment. And thank you all so much.
Well, I'll take just a moment to thank you. I know you need to go. So Dr. Webb, thank you so much for talking with us. Thank you so much for introducing your project. We can't wait till the documentary comes out, and hoping to somehow get your project here and a traveling exhibition here in Dallas as well. It's an eye-opening moment of as we're working with sort of liberation struggle, theaters of absurdity, and all of these concepts that you've given us of imagining and reimagining and looking forward while also understanding the past, and balancing all of this is something that we can all look forward to in building a better future. So thank you so much for your time and for this amazing talk and for the energy and the passion you put into it. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, you all. I hope that this is the first conversation of many.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Almas.
Can't wait to see your documentary.
Absolutely. I'll be sure to keep you all posted on all the things.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.